Maybe we just stay with the feeling for a second, because that's where this really started. Not with a lawyer, not with a bank statement, not with a confrontation in a hallway. It started with a feeling I couldn't name. The kind that sits behind your sternum and doesn't move. The kind that shows up when something is wrong, but you don't have the words for it yet. This isn't a story about getting even. I want to say that up front. I know what channel you're on. I know what you came here expecting. But what actually happened to me, what I actually learned, was something quieter than revenge and a lot harder to carry. So let's go back to the beginning. It was my grandmother's 79th birthday. Not a milestone number, but she'd asked for a real dinner. Not a restaurant, not catered. She wanted the table with the good china, the candles, the whole thing. My uncle had flown in from Phoenix. My aunt was there. My cousin Marcus drove up from Charlotte. And my father's older brother, my Uncle Dale, was sitting at the head of the table like he always does when my grandmother lets him, which is more often than it should be. I hadn't seen my grandmother in almost 4 months. I'd been working double shifts at a structural engineering firm in Raleigh, trying to make rent and pay down my student loans at the same time, and the 3-hour drive each way felt like something I kept meaning to do and kept not doing. I felt guilty about that. Still do, honestly. So I walked in that evening with flowers, a card, and a lot of quiet relief at seeing her standing at the stove, stirring something, looking exactly the same as she always had. She hugged me longer than usual. I noticed that. I filed it away. Dinner was good. The kind of loud, overlapping conversation that happens when you get a certain kind of Southern family in one room. My Uncle Dale told a story about a fishing trip. My aunt laughed too hard at it. My cousin Marcus and I caught eyes across the table and did that thing, where you communicate an entire paragraph without saying a word. Then my grandmother put down her fork, looked at me directly and said, "Did you ever get that sorted out? The money situation?" I smiled. "I did. Thank you so much for that, by the way. The $400 really helped with the security deposit." The table went quiet. Not gradually, all at once. My grandmother's expression didn't change, exactly, but something behind her eyes did. She set both hands flat on the tablecloth, very still, and she looked at me the way you look at someone when you're trying to decide how much they already know. She said, "The $400. It wasn't a question. It was a repetition. Like she was testing the sound of it. "Yeah," I said. "The envelope you sent through Dale. It was really—" "I sent you $3,000, my grandmother said. She said it the way you say something you've known for a long time and finally stopped pretending you didn't. The room stayed quiet. My Uncle Dale picked up his glass of water and took a very long, very deliberate sip. I want to be clear about something, because it matters for everything that comes after. My grandmother is not a wealthy woman in the way people picture when they hear stories like this. She's not sitting on a fortune. She taught elementary school for 31 years. My grandfather, who passed 11 years ago, drove a city bus and coached Little League on weekends. What they had, they saved carefully, slowly, over decades. The kind of money that takes a lifetime to accumulate and a moment to lose. $3,000 was not nothing to her. It was a deliberate, meaningful gift. She told me, in a card she mailed separately that I only found out about later, that she wanted me to have a real start in my new city, that she remembered what it felt like to be young and stretched thin and trying to build something. I never got that card either. My Uncle Dale drove 4 hours to personally hand me an envelope at my apartment door, 6 weeks before that dinner. He made a point of telling me it was from her. He made a point of staying for coffee, asking about my job, asking if I was doing okay. He was warm and unhurried and present in a way that, looking back, felt rehearsed. I handed him a thank you card to give to her on his way back through town. She never got that either. After dinner, I stayed to help clean up. Dale had left early. Something about the drive. My aunt and uncle from Phoenix were putting the kids to bed in the guest room. It was just me and my grandmother at the kitchen sink, and she was very quiet in a way she almost never is. I asked her to tell me exactly what she'd sent. She'd written a check for $3,000. She'd given it to Dale in an unsealed envelope, along with a handwritten card, because he was driving through Raleigh anyway, and she thought it would be more personal than mailing it. He'd told her he handed it to me directly. He'd even described my reaction, said I was overwhelmed, that I'd gotten a little emotional, that I'd asked him to thank her. None of that happened. I stood there at the sink, and I felt something rearrange itself inside me. Not anger, not yet. Something colder, the slow recognition that you've been made into a prop in someone else's lie. I asked her how long Dale had been handling things for her. Financial things, I mean, errands, bill pay, that kind of thing. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "About 2 years, since my hip." I drove back to Raleigh that night with my hands very steady on the wheel and my mind working in a direction I didn't want it to go. I'm not an investigator. I'm a structural engineer, but what I do, fundamentally, is look at systems and figure out where they're under stress. I look for the place where the load is being carried wrong. I look for what's hidden inside the wall. Over the next 3 weeks, I started asking quiet questions. I called my grandmother every few days, which I should have been doing anyway. I kept the conversations light, but I paid attention. I started building a picture. Dale had moved back to his hometown, 40 minutes from my grandmother, about 2.5 years ago after his second divorce. He'd framed it as wanting to be closer to family. He'd started showing up at her house, fixing things, driving her to appointments. My grandmother, who is proud and independent and hates asking for help, had found it easier to accept help that just appeared. That's how it works, I'd come to understand. It doesn't start with theft. It starts with presence, with being the one who's there, with making yourself indispensable until the other person's life has quietly reorganized itself around your involvement. I asked my grandmother, gently, whether she had a financial advisor. She said Dale had suggested she consolidate some things for simplicity. She said he'd helped her set up online access for her checking account, so she didn't have to drive to the bank. She said this like it was a kindness. I asked if she still got her paper statements. She thought about it. Dale said it was easier to go paperless, better for the environment. I want to stop here for a second because I know what some of you are thinking. Why didn't she question it? Why didn't she notice? And I understand that impulse. I had it too, early on, and I'm ashamed of it. Because the truth is that my grandmother is sharp. She's funny and opinionated, and she reads 2 newspapers a day. She's not confused or diminished. She trusted her nephew. He is her late husband's nephew. Someone she helped raise after his mother left. Someone she brought to Christmas and made birthday cakes for. She trusted him the way you trust someone who has been in your life for 50 years, the way most of us would. That trust was the mechanism. It wasn't a weakness. It was something real that he decided to use. I drove down on a Saturday and asked if I could take her to lunch. Just the 2 of us. On the way home, I asked if she'd be willing to call the bank with me, just to go over her account together. I told her I'd been reading about elder financial fraud and I was worried, and I used that word carefully because I didn't want to name Dale yet. I didn't have enough. She agreed, but I could see it cost her something to agree, like she was already beginning to know what we might find. We sat at her kitchen table with her laptop and her reading glasses, and we called the bank together, and I stayed very calm while the account history loaded on the screen. I'm going to give you the shape of what we found without every number, because the numbers aren't the point, and also because they're hers, not mine to lay out in full. What I can tell you is that over approximately 22 months, the pattern was consistent. Transfers to a secondary account, one that had been added to her profile roughly 2 years ago, authorized under a set of login credentials she didn't recognize as hers. The amounts varied. Some were small, some were not. There were a handful of checks made out to cash, in her handwriting, that she did not remember writing. The $3,000 she'd meant to give me was one of maybe 30 transactions she hadn't chosen to make. She sat very still while we looked at this together. Then she said, "I thought I just wasn't keeping track." That's the other thing it does to you. It makes you doubt your own mind. It makes you think the problem is your memory, your attention, your age. That's not an accident. That's the design. I want to tell you what I did next, because I think this part matters. I didn't call Dale. I didn't drive to his house. I didn't confront him in a parking lot or send an angry text or do any of the things I was thinking about doing at 11 o'clock that Saturday night when I couldn't sleep. I called an elder law attorney on Monday morning. I found her through a legal aid referral, and she spoke to me for 40 minutes on that first call, which she didn't have to do. And she told me the most useful thing anyone said to me throughout this whole process. She said, "Document everything before you move." She said, "The moment you confront, assets move." She said, "Your job right now is to gather, not to act." So I gathered. Over the next 5 weeks, I requested paper statements going back 3 years. I logged every transaction we couldn't account for. I cross-referenced dates with what I knew about Dale's schedule, when he'd visited, when he'd offered to help with something. I built a spreadsheet that I kept on a flash drive and a printed copy I kept in my car, not in my grandmother's house. I want to be honest. I made mistakes early on. I showed my grandmother some of my notes too soon, before I knew what I had. She got scared and called Dale. Not to accuse him, just because she was frightened and he was who she called when she was frightened. He showed up at her house that evening with takeout and a lot of warmth and said something had probably gone wrong with the online setup, that these things happened, that he'd look into it. That phone call cost me about a week. It also confirmed something I needed to know. There were other people I had to navigate. My grandmother has 3 children. My father passed when I was 16. His sister, my Aunt Renee, lives in Florida and calls every Sunday and means well and would have made this loud and public and complicated the moment she knew. My grandmother's youngest, Uncle Victor, is kind and conflict-averse, and his first instinct would have been to give Dale a chance to explain. I made a decision, with advice from the attorney, to keep the circle small until we had filed. That's a harder decision than it sounds. You're holding something heavy and you can't put it down and you can't share the weight. You show up to family things and watch the person who did this move through the room like everything is normal. You watch your grandmother laugh at something he says, and you hold the shape of what you know very still inside your chest. But the attorney was right. The day we filed the police report and the bank fraud claim simultaneously, using language she coached me on, specific and technical and without emotional editorializing, the response time was completely different than if we'd walked in with a folder of worried feelings. Institutions move quickly when you give them a structure they recognize. When you say unauthorized electronic funds transfer, account access without documented power of attorney, and pattern of financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult in the right sequence, to the right people with documentation behind it, things begin to move. Dale was interviewed by the county sheriff's department 11 days after we filed. He had explanations. Of course he did. He said she'd asked him to manage things. He said there were expenses she'd agreed to, things for the house, reimbursements. He said it was a misunderstanding. The attorney told us this was typical. She said, "Let the documentation answer. The secondary account, the one that had been added to my grandmother's profile without her knowledge, was in Dale's name. The login credentials used to make the transfers had an IP address registered to his home address. The checks made out to cash had inconsistencies in my grandmother's signature that a handwriting analysis would later support. He did not have a power of attorney. He had never been formally authorized to act on her behalf in any financial capacity. He had simply been trusted, and he had used that trust like a key. I'm not going to tell you that what came next was clean or fast, because it wasn't. Legal processes don't move the way we want them to. There are continuances and paperwork and phone calls that don't get returned. There are days when you wonder if any of it is going to amount to anything, or if the system is just going to absorb all of this effort and produce nothing. What I can tell you is that Dale eventually entered a plea agreement. He was required to make restitution. The amount is a matter of court record. I'll let the public record hold that. He does not come to family events anymore. He does not call my grandmother. Whether she is grieved that, the loss of someone she loved, regardless of what he did, is something she and I have talked about quietly, and it belongs to her. What I can tell you is that my grandmother's accounts are restructured. There is a certified financial caregiver involved. There are 2 signatures required for anything above a threshold amount. Her paper statements come to a P.O. box that she and I both have access to. She knows every number, every account, every balance. She is involved in all of it in a way that she wasn't before, because before, involvement felt like burden. Now she understands that involvement is protection. I stayed with her for 2 weeks after everything settled. We painted the back porch. We went to the farmer's market on Saturday, and she argued loudly with a vendor about the price of peaches, and I stood next to her and felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. She asked me one evening, sitting on that freshly painted porch, whether I felt like I'd done the right thing. She wasn't asking me to reassure her. She was genuinely curious about where I'd landed. I thought about it for a while before I answered. I told her that I used to think the right thing would feel like relief, like you'd done the hard thing and then the weight would lift. But it doesn't work that way. You still carry what you saw. You still know what a person you trusted was capable of. You still have to decide every time you see someone you love, whether you're paying attention closely enough, whether you're present enough, whether 3 hours round trip is actually as hard as you made it out to be. The right thing isn't a destination. It's more like a direction. You keep orienting toward it, and you hope that adds up to something over time. She nodded. She said, "Your grandfather would have liked you." I've been holding on to that since October. I expect I'll hold on to it for a long time. If you're watching this and something about it landed differently than you expected, if you're thinking about someone in your family, an older parent or grandparent, someone who has a person in their life who handles things, I want to say this plainly. You don't have to wait for a number that shocks you. You don't have to wait for a dinner table moment. You can ask now. You can call and ask if they want to look at their accounts together, just to make sure everything looks right, just to make sure their information is current. You can do it out of love rather than out of alarm, and it will be received that way. The earlier you look, the more you find. The more you find, the more of it you can still do something about. I'm not telling you to suspect everyone. I'm telling you that presence is protective. That showing up, actually showing up, not just meaning to, is one of the most concrete things you can do for the people who matter to you. That's what this was, for me, in the end. Not a legal case, not a story about a bad person who got caught. It was a lesson in what happens when we let distance and busyness make the decisions for us. When we assume someone else is handling it. When we don't ask questions because asking feels intrusive. The questions aren't intrusive. The silence is what costs you. Show up. Look at the numbers. Say the uncomfortable thing at the dinner table. Even if you're not sure why it matters yet. Sometimes the most important conversation starts with the most ordinary sentence, and you don't realize what it opened until the whole room goes quiet.